You ever notice how every time a massive scandal drops, the loudest people in the room are the ones pretending they're shocked, even though they were sitting front row for the whole show? The new Diddy doc didn't just reopen old wounds, it exposed just how many folks suddenly discovered their memory card once the cameras started rolling. And somehow, Misa Brim ended up pulled into a storyline she never asked to be part of, all because the industry loves rewriting history when it's convenient. If you're here for the truth without the filter, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Fame Insight is climbing from 3,000 to 10, and you're early enough to say you were here before the crowd. Stay locked in, you don't want to miss what comes next. Misa Brim didn't ask for a comeback storyline, yet the moment that documentary landed on Netflix, her name got pulled back into the public arena like someone dusting off an old file just to stir the pot. She wasn't hovering around the spotlight, wasn't teasing a tell-all, wasn't dropping hints for attention. She was focused on her businesses, her nonprofits, her actual life, staying in her lane while the internet built conspiracy charts around her name. And out of nowhere, she's treated like she volunteered for a second round of the bad boy era's chaos, when in reality she declined to participate from the jump. The frustration in her response is almost tangible. She made it clear she didn't want to be part of the documentary, yet the creators stitched her into the narrative anyway, as if they needed a familiar name to glue the story together. Imagine moving forward for years, only for people you haven't spoken to since flip phones were a thing to suddenly narrate your past like they were there for every conversation. It's intrusive, and honestly, it's lazy storytelling masquerading as context. And the wildest part, the public instantly forgot who Misa actually is. Not the ex, not the drama character, but the pioneer who shaped hip-hop fashion, the creator who influenced entire eras of styling, the woman who kept building even while dealing with the emotional blast radius of someone else's empire. She's accomplished too much to be reduced to a footnote in someone else's documentary. Yet that's exactly how it played out: convenient, selective, and one-sided. But here's the twist: the doc resurfacing her name wasn't even the real spark. It was everything that happened after that turned the conversation into a wildfire. Once the industry insiders and longtime associates started chiming in, suddenly everyone had a memory they'd kept on mute for decades. And the second they opened their mouths, the entire situation shifted from messy to explosive. Are you still with me? Because now we're stepping into the part where the quiet whispers turn into full-volume confessions. Erik's sermon stepped into the conversation like someone casually dropping a match in a room full of dry paper. One minute he's reminiscing about the past, and the next he's unpacking a whole triangle that sounds less like real life and more like the early draft of a hip-hop noir. According to him, he and Misa had a friendship. Maybe more, maybe not. But it was enough to catch Diddy's eye, and not in a friendly wish-you-the-best kind of way. The way he talks about Misa being pulled closer, monitored, isolated, it's the kind of story that makes you raise an eyebrow and think, so this was considered regular industry behavior back then? And honestly, the way Erik frames it, the whole thing feels less like a love triangle and more like a trophy chase with a beat playing underneath. But here's where things really start to shift. Erik's comments alone would have been enough to shake the table. But the moment he finished talking, someone else stepped in with a story that took everything to another level. Erik opened the door. Someone else walked through it with the kind of details that make people stop scrolling. Are you still there? Good. Because the next voice in this saga is the one that really lit everything up. Kirk Burrowes didn't just enter the conversation. He dropped a narrative that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Unlike Erik, who spoke in that casual "this is how things were" tone, Kirk came in with specifics, the kind of details that make everyone sit up because they don't sound like rumors, they sound like memories he's tried to outrun. As a co-founder of Bad Boy and someone who watched Diddy's rise from the inside, his words carried a weight that couldn't be brushed off as nostalgia or exaggeration. And when he described witnessing a physical altercation between Puff and Misa, the whole energy shifted. You could feel people stiffen, pause, rewind, question what else he's seen, and kept tucked away. Kirk's account wasn't loud, but it was sharp, a quiet statement with the force of a headline. He wasn't speaking like someone looking for attention. He was speaking like someone finally letting a truth slip through after holding it back for years. And that's the part that hit the hardest. You don't get that tone from someone inventing a story. You get that tone from someone who's been sitting with something heavy, because saying it back then wasn't an option. What made his revelation even more unsettling was the implication beneath it, that if he saw something once, it probably wasn't the only time someone saw something. A moment like that rarely stays in complete isolation. It creates whispers, tension, people exchanging glances and pretending they didn't. And when Kirk spoke, spoke, you could practically hear decades of silence echoing behind him. But the moment he finished telling his piece, the narrative did something strange. Instead of everyone addressing the actual content of what he revealed, the focus started drifting somewhere else, away from what was said and toward why he was saying it now. Suddenly, the timeline became more important than the truth, and the entire conversation pivoted into deflection mode. And that's where the real chaos started to brew, because the loudest pushback didn't come from random people online. It came from a platform with history, influence, and a long track record of protecting their own. Are you with me? Good, because next is where the mic gets passed to a place that should have delivered clarity, but instead delivered something else entirely. The Breakfast Club stepped in like they were auditioning for the role of voice of reason, but somehow delivered the exact opposite. Instead of unpacking what Kirk actually said, the seriousness of it, the history behind it, the weight he carried as someone who helped build Bad Boy, they zeroed in on the timing, as if the calendar mattered more than the content. Charlemagne questioned why Kirk didn't speak earlier, throwing out that familiar, tired line about preventing future harm, a line that always sounds noble until you remember who's saying it and who they've protected over the years. It wasn't journalism, it was selective outrage dressed up as commentary, and that's what made the moment so uncomfortable. You could hear them skating around the heart of the issue like they were afraid of slipping on something they already knew too much about. The tone wasn't curiosity, it was deflection. When a man with that level of insider access says he witnessed something, the response should be, what exactly happened? Not, why didn't you bring this up 20 years ago? It was a masterclass in missing the point, and everyone watching felt it. Then came the subtle alignment, the soft defense, the gentle questioning, the casual dismissal. They moved past the allegations like they were discussing an old rumor, instead of a first-hand account. And when they brushed off the gravity of what was said with polite skepticism, it became clear they weren't trying to understand the story, they were trying to manage it. That's the thing about media institutions. Sometimes they're not protecting the public, they're protecting proximity. What made the whole exchange worse was how familiar the pattern felt. This wasn't the first time they redirected a conversation away from someone powerful and toward the people speaking up. It's a playbook. Undermine the messenger, minimize the mess, move on before the audience notices. But this time, people noticed. And the backlash didn't come from a fringe corner of the internet. It came from viewers who've watched these dynamics play out for years. So while the Breakfast Club was busy asking why the truth didn't surface sooner, the real question was why they seemed so bothered that it surfaced at all. Are you still with me? Because now we're entering the part of the story where the public stops whispering and starts pointing out every crack in that polished media veneer. The moment the Breakfast Club started questioning the timing instead of the content, the public snapped right back with a question of their own. Why do people always act like speaking up late is a bigger offense than the behavior itself? That line, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" has been weaponized so many times it's practically a script. It shifts blame, dulls accountability, and puts the burden of stopping the harm on the people who were living through it. And when Charlemagne tossed it out there, it felt less like curiosity and more like a deflection polished enough to pass as commentary. The internet didn't miss the contradiction. Folks immediately pointed out that the same voices demanding early disclosure are often the ones who would have dismissed those stories if they had been told in real time. It's always easy to tell someone what they should have done when you weren't the one dealing with the pressure, the power dynamic, or the fear of being crushed by an industry that protects money far more aggressively than it protects people. And let's be honest, if Kirk had said this decades ago, those same mics probably would have been used to drown him out, not amplify him. That's the uncomfortable truth the audience wasn't willing to let slide. People began calling out the irony of the Breakfast Club suddenly positioning themselves as champions of prevention, when they've been hand-picked gatekeepers long enough to know exactly how the business works. It's easy to talk about courage when you're sitting in a studio buffered by corporate contracts and brand partnerships. It's a lot harder to tell the truth when you're in the same ecosystem as the person you're exposing. The comments online were blunt. Survivors are often silenced by money, fear, or the knowledge that speaking out will cost them everything. And insiders, they know even more. They've seen careers frozen, deals snatched, lives turned upside down for daring to speak up. So when people ask why now, the real question should be, why did this industry make now the only safe time? And this is where the whole situation becomes even more revealing, because pointing the finger at the people coming forward is the easiest distraction in the world. It keeps the spotlight off the person at the center and reroutes the conversation toward the timelines, the motives, the memories, anything other than the behavior itself. And that's why viewers started to push back hard. They saw the misdirection happening in real time. But here's the part nobody wants to dissect out loud. Timing wasn't the issue, power was. And the second the public realized realized that, the entire narrative shifted from confusion to clarity. Still with me? Good, because the next part exposes the unspoken rule that shaped this whole circus from the beginning. The industry has always had an unspoken contract, and it's not written in ink, it's written in silence. People love to pretend these revelations are sudden, like everyone just discovered the truth last Tuesday, but insiders have known the temperature of that room for decades. In a business built on power, access, and gatekeeping, telling the truth isn't just risky, it's a career-ending stunt, and that's why so many stayed quiet. Not because nothing happened, but because the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of swallowing it. When someone as connected as Kirk hesitated for years, it tells you everything you need to know about how the system protects those at the top. And here's the part people like to ignore. The music world runs on hierarchy, not honesty. If you're valuable to the machine, your mistakes get brushed under the rug. If you threaten the machine, suddenly everybody's got amnesia. Loyalty gets repackaged as professionalism, fear gets disguised as respect, and silence becomes a survival tactic. For years, people around Diddy didn't just remain quiet. They adapted. They learned what topics to avoid, what stories to laugh off, which moments to pretend they didn't witness. That's not loyalty. That's self-preservation in an environment where speaking up could get you iced out faster than a failed debut single. What makes this era different is that the machine isn't as airtight as it used to be. Social media cracked the doors open. Lawsuits pried them wider, and now the truth is leaking from places nobody expected. The same insiders who once kept everything under lock and key are realizing the world finally shifted enough to make speaking out possible. Not comfortable, not easy, just possible. And that tiny window of safety is why these stories are surfacing now, not because people suddenly grew courageous overnight. It's almost funny, in a dark fame insight way, how people act stunned that silence dominated for so long, when silence is the industry's favorite currency. You protect the powerful, or you get removed from the room entirely. That's why the sudden wave of disclosures feels less like coincidence and more like overdue honesty colliding with a collapsing power structure. People aren't talking because they want fame. They're talking because for the first time, the consequences might not outweigh the truth. And once you see that, everything else starts making sense. The timing, the tension, the urgency. This isn't random. It's the natural outcome of decades of suppressed stories finally having somewhere to go. Still with me? Good. Because the next part isn't about the ecosystem that hid the behavior. It's about the person who lived through it long before the internet turned it into a headline. Misa's history with Diddy isn't some vague rumor floating around the industry. It's documented, complicated, and layered with the kind of emotional turbulence most people wouldn't survive, let alone build a legacy on. Long before Netflix decided to turn her past into a plot device, she was dealing with very real fallout, financial battles, public disrespect, and the kind of uneven treatment that told you exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of his world. While Kim Porter reportedly received generous support, Misa was fighting for basic stability, even facing eviction from the home he was supposed to cover. That wasn't a minor oversight. That was a message, deliberate and punishing, and through all of it, Misa kept moving. She raised Justin, built a career, influenced an entire culture's look, and didn't publicly weaponize her history even when she had every reason to. The world forgets how pioneering she was because the drama always gets louder than the accomplishments. But Misa was shaping hip-hop fashion before most of the industry even knew what branding meant. She took scraps of support and built something solid. The kind of resilience people love to romanticize when it's convenient, but ignore when it explains the sharp edges someone develops along the way. What makes her story hit harder now is the emotional whiplash of being dragged back into a chapter she closed years ago. She endured the chaos quietly, survived the imbalance, and carved out a space untouched by the noise. So having her name resurfaced in a doc she declined to be part of, and watching strangers narrate her life like they were her biographers, wasn't just intrusive, it was re-traumatizing for someone who already paid the price and rebuilt herself afterward. The irony is that people now want her to comment, confirm, deny, explain, relive, as if surviving the reality wasn't enough. But that's the issue with public memory. It loves the sensational parts and ignores the human cost. Misa's story isn't about being an accessory to anyone's downfall. It's about surviving someone else's power trip while still managing to build a life, a brand, and a legacy with her own hands. And this is where the whole narrative circles back to a single question. Why is everyone putting the spotlight on the people who spoke, the people who were hurt, the people who endured, instead of turning it toward the one person whose behavior created the storm in the first place? Stay with me, because that's exactly where we're going next. Here's the thing, nobody in the mainstream wants to say out loud. The energy is aimed in every direction except the one that actually matters. People are dissecting Kirk's timing, critiquing Erik's phrasing, questioning Misa's silence, debating the documentary's editing, but somehow the person at the epicenter of all this chaos keeps slipping through the cracks like a magician pulling off the easiest trick in the world. It's almost impressive how quickly the conversation turns into a blame buffet, where everyone gets a plate except the one who cooked the mess in the first place. And that's the game. Redirect, deflect, dissect the side characters while the main character stays conveniently blurred in the background. It's the oldest move in the industry handbook. If you keep the audience arguing about the people reacting, they won't focus on the person who caused the reactions. Suddenly, it's "why didn't you speak?" instead of "why did he act like this?" It's "why now?" instead of "what happened then?" The narrative flips so smoothly you almost miss the sleight of hand. Almost. But the audience isn't as gullible as the industry seems to think. People are finally calling out how ridiculous it is to interrogate everyone except the individual whose behavior created the fallout. The truth is, you don't get multiple insiders describing the same pattern unless something deeper was happening. You don't get decades of whispered stories unless people were afraid to say them out loud. And you definitely don't get this kind of collective shift unless the mask slipped long before Netflix pressed play. What makes this moment so revealing is how the documentary didn't actually expose anything new. It just forced people to stop pretending they didn't know. The silence wasn't ignorance, it was convenience. And now that the convenience has evaporated, the real story is finally surfacing. Not a tale of late confessions, but a decades-long pattern everyone stepped around because the truth was bad for business. So as everyone keeps pointing fingers at each other, the real question stands untouched. Why is the outrage aimed at the people speaking up rather than the one who made speaking up necessary? And if that question makes people uncomfortable, good. That discomfort means we're finally getting close to the core, because everything you've heard so far, that's just the prelude. The real story, the one they don't want to unravel, goes much deeper than the documentary dared to show. The further you zoom out, the clearer the hypocrisy becomes. Everyone is busy debating the ethics of timing and the accuracy of anecdotes, but nobody wants to talk about the ecosystem that let all of this flourish in the first place. The documentary didn't reveal a monster hiding in the shadows. It revealed an industry that kept feeding the shadows and calling it the cost of doing business. The silence wasn't just personal, it was structural. People didn't stay quiet because they liked him. They stayed quiet because the machine rewarded obedience and punished anyone who dared to challenge its golden boy. And that's why the backlash toward the people speaking now feels so misplaced. It's easy to sit in the comfort of hindsight and claim moral high ground, but back then, nobody was protecting you if you spoke up. There were no sympathetic headlines, no viral support, no social media ready to amplify your voice. There was only power and the understanding that one wrong move could erase your career before you even got a chance to build it. That's the part the public forgets. Fear isn't weakness. In this business, it was standard practice. What's even more telling is how quickly the narrative shifts when the power imbalance starts cracking. Suddenly, the same industry that once dismissed victims as messy, jealous, or seeking attention is interested in their stories, not because the culture changed, but because the shield around the powerful finally broke. People aren't emboldened by bravery. They're emboldened by the fact that the consequences for telling the truth are finally less severe than the consequences of staying quiet. And here's the twist that ties everything together. The documentary wasn't the catalyst. It was the excuse. The real shift happened the moment the public stopped accepting polished PR as gospel. The moment people realized the industry wasn't protecting talent, it was protecting investments. Once that facade cracked, the truth didn't just seep out, it poured out, dragging decades of buried stories with it. So as everyone continues shouting about who waited too long, who said too much, or who didn't say enough, the actual point is getting buried beneath the noise. This isn't a story about late revelations. It's a story about a culture that made early revelations impossible. And now that the walls are finally crumbling, the truth is doing what it always does when suppressed for too long, spilling everywhere and forcing everyone to confront what they pretended not to see. Are you still with me? Good. Because now that the dust is settling, it's time to ask the one question the documentary didn't dare leave hanging. What happens when the truth is no longer optional, and the people who kept the silence alive can no longer hide behind the shadows they helped create? Once the noise dies down, the real question finally shows itself. What happens when the truth can't be buried anymore? The documentary cracked the door open, but the public kicked it wide, forcing everyone who once hid behind silence to face the part they played. You can't blame timing, you can't blame memory, and you can't blame the people speaking now. The spotlight is finally where it should have been all along, on the power, the protection, and the system that kept the truth locked up for years. And now that the lock's broken, nobody's getting to pretend they didn't know what was behind the door. When you strip away the noise, the finger-pointing, the timelines, and the deflections, the simplest truth is also the hardest one for the industry to swallow. Silence didn't happen in a vacuum. It was engineered, rewarded, and enforced. The people who stayed quiet weren't just passive bystanders. They were navigating a world where speaking out meant choosing between your livelihood and your conscience. That's not cowardice, that's survival. And now that the truth has finally slipped into public view, the same individuals who once benefited from the silence are scrambling to rewrite their roles, suddenly shocked by a story they helped keep under wraps. The shift didn't happen because courage magically increased. It happened because the power structure holding everything together finally cracked. For years, people acted like questioning Diddy was a career-ending stunt, the kind of move that got you uninvited, unsupported, unheard. Now the shield around him is gone, and the stories that were once whispered in small circles are being said out loud because the consequences aren't as devastating as they used to be. The imbalance changed, not the truth. And as that imbalance collapses, everyone who stayed quiet is trying to find a safe place to stand. What's happening now is bigger than individual accusations. It's the unveiling of an industry built on the belief that protecting the powerful is more important than protecting the people around them. It's the slow realization that the silence wasn't a coincidence, it was the culture. And once that culture starts falling apart, all the truth people tried to outrun finally catches up. So the real question isn't why now, it's how long did everyone expect this to stay buried? Because once the foundation starts cracking, the fall isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Are you still with me? Because from here on out, the excuses get thinner, the masks get looser, and the truth, the one everyone danced around for decades, finally gets its turn to speak. The wildest part of this entire saga is how the industry still pretends shock is an appropriate reaction. They watched the storms for years, felt the tension in every room, saw the patterns repeat, and now want to act stunned that the truth finally spilled over. This isn't surprise, it's inconvenience. The documentary didn't expose anything new, it simply forced people to stop acting like they didn't hear the whispers echoing through every backstage hallway. And now the same insiders who once shrugged off the warning signs are running to distance themselves, hoping the public won't remember how comfortable they were when silence was profitable. But the audience remembers, and the audience is paying attention. Every sudden statement, every defensive interview, every carefully worded comment sounds like people scrambling to avoid getting swept into the fallout. That's the cost of a collapsing structure. Once the walls start falling, everyone who leaned on them starts pretending they barely touched the thing. Yet the truth always knows who kept it locked away, who watered it, who benefited from its quiet. And now that it's out in the open, the performance of innocence feels thinner by the minute. The industry expected a scandal, it did not expect accountability. And that's why everything feels so chaotic now. The old rules don't work anymore. People are finally calling out the misplaced outrage, the deflection tactics, the selective memory. They're done blaming the ones who spoke and ignoring the one who made speaking necessary. And once that narrative flips, there's no flipping it back. So here we are, a story decades in the making, exposed not because the truth changed, but because the world finally got tired of pretending it couldn't see what was right in front of it. The silence that protected the powerful is cracking, the excuses are wearing thin, and the people who spent years dodging hard conversations are running out of places to hide. This isn't the end of the story, it's the part where the curtain gets pulled back, and everyone has to decide whether they're standing in the light or the shadows. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer Fame Insight is built for. Sharp, curious, and not fooled by the polished version of events the industry keeps trying to sell. Hit that subscribe button and help push this channel past the next milestone on the road to 10,000. Stick around because the deeper we go, the more the truth stops whispering and starts shouting.